So if you've come to hear us talk about making New Orleans, nurturing growth, mitigating disaster, and rebirth, you're in the right place. So let me introduce our panel for you. John Barry is an award-winning author of best-selling history books, including Rising Tide and The Great Influenza. His historical knowledge of the river and its politics got him appointed to chair a bipartisan working group on flood protection by the state's congressional delegation after Hurricane Katrina. And he ended up also serving 7 years as a member and sometimes president and sometimes lightning rod of the Southeastern Louisiana Flood Protection Authority, which oversees levee districts in New Orleans on the east bank of the river. And his website says he's working on a book relating to issues raised during that tenure. Kristina Ford is best known in New Orleans for her long stints as executive director of the Planning Commission and then as deputy mayor for facilities, infrastructure, and community development between 1999 and 2011. A period that included Katrina and its aftermath. Since then, she served stints as a selectman in the town of Boothbay in Maine and as a member of the Maine's Governor's Climate Council. She's the author of several books on planning, including The Trouble with City Planning, which was published in 2010. And then we have Richard Campanella, a geographer and associate dean for research at Tulane School of Architecture. He's prolific. He's the author of 14 books, most about geography, history, and culture in the New Orleans region. He's a regular contributor to the Times-Picayune and an expert on the region's geographic changes through history. His latest book, with a hardcover edition arriving in May, is Draining New Orleans, the 300-year quest to dewater the Crescent City. Just a quick note about myself. I was a reporter for the Times-Picayune from 1984 until it shuttered in June 2019, and then joined the newly named Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, in July 2019, and I'm still there. While most of my time at the two papers has been spent covering coastal issues, levees, and the environment, I did cover City Hall for a year and a half during Mark Morial's term, so crossed paths with Kristina then. I also covered the Levee Authority during part of John's tenure there, and of course an avid reader of Rich's history. And in the aftermath of Katrina, I too co-authored a book on the storm titled Path of Destruction, the Devastation of New Orleans and the Coming Age of Superstorms. So, in my point of view, our three guests are perfect for discussing the truly existential issues facing New Orleans today and the rest of the United States. How to live with water and global warming fueled sea level rise. How to deal with those issues in the midst of what always seems to be a broken political system where today's demands often don't meet tomorrow's needs. And are there lessons we can find in New Orleans' 300-year history that might help us move into that future? So, John, let me start with you. Are we safe in the city of New Orleans today? And where will we be in the future?
Well, those of you in the room probably live here, and you probably know that the Corps talks about risk reduction. They don't talk about safety. You may or may not know what a 100-year storm means. A 1% chance of exceeding in a given year. It doesn't mean once in 100 years. And in any person's lifetime, the average person's lifetime, there's a better than 60% chance that they will see at least one storm that exceeds that standard. So whether we're safe or not, it's a very relative statement. We're safer than we were. The system that was built before Katrina, in theory, protected against a 250 to 300-year storm. Obviously, it failed because of poor design, primarily on the flood walls. So, you know, I can't give a yes or no answer as to whether we're safe, and it's getting riskier.
Are there other things that need to be done to increase our protection from storm surge?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could be done. You know, obviously, the master plan, which is underfunded, you know, when the BP money runs out in a few years, where that money is going to come from is you know, very, very big question. That's one of the reasons that when I was on the Flood Protection Authority, we sued oil companies to ask them to pay for restoring the part of the damage that they did. There's something that I think could be done inside the city that perhaps maybe Kristina and Richard could speak to. In the Netherlands, they have what they call polders. They divide areas into sections so that if one compartment breaks, levees breached or something like that, it doesn't take on the entire city. I've been very disappointed that there hasn't been a movement inside New Orleans to try to develop polders. That would really involve the Sewage and Water Board, as well as, you know, the Flood Protection Authority, and it would take a lot of leadership from both the business community and political leadership.
So, Kristina, let me ask you, a perfect opportunity to talk about that. It looks to me, being a reporter who's been covering this for quite some time, that there's this disconnect between what people want done to stop flooding in their neighborhoods today and what the long-term efforts are and the ability of an urban area like New Orleans to deal with that, and especially a city like New Orleans that has such a lack of funds and such a big backlog of projects to do. Can you talk about that?
Sure, I can talk about it, but before I do, I wrote a book that was called The Trouble with City Planning, which was about the 3 plans that were written and then discarded right after Katrina. And at the time, I was real excited to start writing that book, but a friend of mine who worked for me in the Planning Commission said, how are you going to keep it to 1 volume? And so here we are. This is volume 2. Oh, I was assured everyone could hear me. I'll try harder. Anyway.
That's better.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. But to answer your question, I think what I have always felt in New Orleans that there was no sense of urgency among people in government who were responsible for planning. And I especially felt that after Katrina. I went to a meeting in which a man who was leading it, who was back, you know, in New Orleans after the flood, and the popular phrase then was, we have to have a conversation among people who are going to be affected by what we're doing. And this man said, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to have a conversation about what that conversation is going to be. And I thought, what? So I'm excited about what we can do, and I'm excited to have the people who are here on this stage with me. What I'm going to talk about today mostly is what I see is a problem, which is there are many good ideas for how we can make ourselves less vulnerable to flooding, and I'm going to use flooding to stand in for all of the various climate change effects. But I think we rely too much on consultants. And the problem in New Orleans, to my mind, is bad management of those consultants. Because how it usually works is that a consultant comes in with promises that they're going to make the city resilient, and they have some town meetings. They ask people to come speak to them and say what's on their mind, and then they go back home and they produce a plan, which is the one they had in mind when they came here, and just use citizens' comments to fill in the need for what they came here already knowing. And that's bad management. I mean, we should have more information from local experts, and local experts are everywhere. Yes, citizens have a big part They need to be able, because they live most granularly in this city, they know what they don't know, and they know what they're scared of. And that's a good place to start, rather than the usual way planners start, which is say, what would you like the town to look like in 20 years? If you ask me that, I'd say, I'd be damned if I know, but I hope I like it. And in particular, I'd say now, I don't want to worry about flooding. And so I think that I have many ideas for this, which I won't go into now, but I think that we need to get consultants. We need the consultants because they have special knowledge from other places, but we really also need to rely on such individuals who live here, who have great knowledge, and those include the three men I'm up here with, who have specific knowledge. I was just saying to Rich that when I was a planning director, I'd read his books, and I had my staff read his books when they would tell me that something wasn't consistent with the neighborhood. And I'd say, what does that mean? And I'd make them go read what Rich had written. But I never spoke to him. I did speak to John Barry. And I think that there are many people in this town who have special knowledge that we do not access. We don't require the consultants to access them. There's also specific knowledge in department heads. These are the guys who drive the streets every day. They know where it's dangerous, and that's specific information that can help a planner who's come from someplace else to try to plan our city. So that's about all I can think of at the beginning.
So, Rich, I always, when I talk about New Orleans and why it's here, I sort of joke that when Bienville formed the city, created the city, that he found the place closest to the mouth of the river that was defensible. At that time, it was defensible against the English. Today, we have a city that we have developed that is defensible against storm surge. What lessons can we learn from the past about how to defend what has become the city of New Orleans and how to make it last into the future?
Well, thank you, and good to see you all. I'll give you three right off the bat. One, and these are lessons from the 1720s up to about 200 years later, and then we started making mistakes. One, build above the grade, okay? Number two, build as much as possible on the natural higher ground, the natural levee we're on right now. And three, use gravity to get the stormwater runoff off that higher ground and let it pond in the area where nature ponded it, which we call the swamp. Now, we weren't particularly enlightened in these areas. The second and third one, we really had no choice. And the first one, we got wrong at first. If you look at the very earliest structures built, the city's founded in 1718, but for the first 4 years, it's rather ad hoc development, and the initial structures are lifted right out of Normandy. They're cross timber. The hipped roofs come right, the eaves come right down to the walls. The cross timber and bossillage is exposed to the heavy rain, and they're not raised at all. They're built on timbers right at ground, and they quickly realize that this isn't going to work. And what they do is they don't completely radically change the design. Rather, they, what you might call, creolize it. They render it more local and native. And so when you start to look at 1730, 1740 structures, they still have the same essential typology and massing, but now they're raised above the grade, and the hipped roof is now oversized, okay, which allows for a gallery, the famous Louisiana gallery. That prevents the rain coming down from hitting the walls. It provides intermediary space and cool in the winter, cool in the summer, and you could go, and the staircases out there. So just an example of how adaptation in a built environment can accommodate an environment like this. Regarding building on the natural levee, Adrien Despoget is probably the most influential early engineer in our history. He was the assistant engineer, and he is the one who played the most direct role in laying out the French Quarter. Again, this is 4 years after the city's founding. And he made a very strategic decision when he first arrived here. Bienville originally planned for the city's x-axis, Decatur Street today, to be about 700 feet back roughly along Royal Street. Poget was very savvy, not just to topography, but also hydrology. He understood that the river did not scour there, that the riverfront was safe, and if anything, it would degrade. And so what he did is pulled that line forward 700 feet, which means as he laid out the city, it got its butt out of the swamp. It got Rampart and Burgundy Street onto higher ground, and that probably spared the city of innumerable back swamp floods. One final thing regarding using gravity to drain the city. Again, we had no choice from the 1720s. I'm talking about stormwater runoff from the 1720s up until the 1830s. And another real influential architect, engineer, geographer, they all had multiple titles, was Barthélemy Lafon, who laid out a number of neighborhoods, a real incredible a jack of all trades and master of many, is probably most famous for what now we call the Lower Garden District. And if you look at the way he managed stormwater runoff there, you could translate it to modern terms and drop it right into David Wagner's urban stormwater management system. It's about slowing down the movement of the runoff, storing it on the surface, retaining it, recharging, filtrating the soils, and making it beautiful. And we were doing this 200 years ago.
So, John, let me get a little bit more into politics and the future. Can you talk to me a little bit about where climate change fits into all of this? I mean, we're spending a hell of a lot of money on a master plan that is aimed at dealing with sea level rise, and that sea level rise is being caused by emissions that are worldwide. Right. But also, Louisiana happens to be one of the states with the biggest amounts of emissions of climate greenhouse gases in the United States. How can we get the Corps to be involved in this effort? Do they have a place?
First, the master plan came out very recently, the latest iteration of it. Just reality here. In a best case scenario, instead of losing 1,100 square miles of land going forward, we'll only lose 800 square miles of land. So it only benefits about 300 square miles, best case. And obviously they have a worst case, which is worse. When you ask about politics and what Rich just said about gravity makes me think of something else involving the Corps. You remember option 2? Okay. We have the drainage canals taking water out of the city to the lake. They have enormous pumps. When that plan was put in, the entire local political community and, the levee board, were kind of outraged. The Corps had another plan called option 2, which involved, you still had pumps out of the lake, but it would use gravity to drain water from the interior of the city to the lakefront. It was somewhat more expensive than using all the pumping systems employed by the Sewage and Water Board, but the Corps went for what they referred to as option 1. I can remember meetings in Washington with the authorizing language for the Corps study literally said, modify the canals. That's a direct quote. And I remember sitting there with the acting head of the Corps of Engineers early in the Obama administration saying they didn't have the authority to even study modifying the canals. Some of this stuff is just crazy. This administration in the larger context is obviously much more friendly to the environment and to worrying about climate change than the last administration. Unfortunately, the state political establishment is still, got its head in the sand, almost literally. I don't know, the Corps functions as, based on what it's told to do. as much as what it's inclined to do. I think the core has gotten a lot greener than it was. It's still not green. You know, if the political forces want the core to do something, it will do it. So the real issue comes with the political forces, not so much inside the core itself, I think.
So, Kristina, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. There's a scientist, John Day at LSU, who has proposed that the future of New Orleans could be saved if the polders were actually elevated. The interior portions of the city were actually risen using sediment from the Bonnie Carey spillway, like everybody already does, you know, except much more of it. But that would require some significant long-term plannings by the city. Is that something that can happen under the present system of government in New Orleans? Is that?
Well, my sense is, unless Mark Morial were the mayor again, no. But that means we're not.
Got to get closer.
I'm sorry. I said that unless Mark Morial were elected mayor again, that's not going to happen. However, in the usual way that you think a mayor comes in and has an agenda like that. However, and this really goes back to what I was saying about how we misuse consultants. Local government here, and now I'm talking about the city, that it prefers to do things by using citizens who come and talk in general terms. And there is so much knowledge in this city that is specific and deep. You've heard just 2 examples of it right here. And I think that what the city really needs to do is figure out a new way to do long-term planning like you're talking about, in which you have a wonderful new idea, raising the polders, and figuring out how you can find people in the community who are supporters of that and champions of that, and that they keep on beating at their council district door and at the mayor's office. I mean, in other words, you activate citizens to do something other than going to a meeting and talking about what they don't like in their neighborhood now. We all don't like the same thing. We don't like feeling vulnerable to what might happen, and it's only a matter of time before it will, in my sense. And so I think there are ways that we can figure out how to use citizens better, but it really depends upon getting people like these 2 and people who are in the Corps of Engineers to talk to each other. And they have to talk, to make it be imperative that they come up with a plan for whatever it is that they think they can do. This isn't vague. It really has to be specific, and give people an outline. You say polders that will be in the lower parts of the city. Where? And I think that kind of information is usually not spoken when we have a conversation about a new idea. We don't get specific. I think that's what doomed what was the great plan after Katrina, which was the first one that the Urban Land Institute had. And I was at the meeting when it was presented. And there were people there, this was in January, right after Katrina, and there were many people there who had gone to great personal pain to get to that meeting. And they did a fine presentation in which they showed how water would be used, like in the lower Ninth Ward, make ways for water to go and sit there so nobody's drowned. And it was the beginning of a good idea. But I remember this so clearly. There's a man sitting in the front row who had been flooded out. He lived in the lower Ninth Ward, and he raised his hand and he said, "What happens to my house?" And I remember this vividly, that the consultants said, well, that's the next stage of thinking, what we're going to do with you. And a different mayor, this was Mayor Nagin, different mayor would have said, well, look, y'all, you go home and you come back in a week and tell us what you are going to do for the people whose houses have been ruined. That can be done in a week. A redevelopment authority could have been at least sketched out. But Nagin lost interest in it, And citizens, you can't blame him. And citizens just thought, these people don't know what they're doing. And so Nagin said, go on home, we'll get another planning group. So there's a great history in this town of like good ideas going away because no one puts enough effort into showing how they're going to work out. So I think that's one thing. When I say use consultants better, use them better to say, what exactly are we going to do in this situation?
Rich, one of the things that I expect to see happening during the next 50 years is something that Louisiana actually has a history with, and that is the actual movement of people who live outside the levee system to areas where they are safer. Are there lessons to be learned from the way that has happened in the past for how we could move forward, for planning for that to actually happen in a way that's not as disruptive as it might be?
Well, it's already happening. There's a steadfast shift of coastal parish populations inland. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to map. What often happens is that the elders continue living in those spaces. The children move on. And first and foremost, they do so because the economic rationale is not, the jobs aren't there. Talking about, lower down in the coastal area. We see this problem really throughout the state of the diminishing size, the decline of our small towns and the flatlining of the population. I want to just quickly address your prior question about the polders. And my answer to that is it ain't going to happen. You cannot reverse urban subsidence that's already happened when people are already living in those neighborhoods. What you can do, of course, is to raise up the houses. But the notion of bringing in sediment, and it would have to be perfectly evenly distributed throughout the neighborhood, right? Streets, houses, gardens, if you make one little indentation, all the water's going to go there. So it's just impractical. The one thing you can do is raise the houses and also slow down or eliminate future subsidence. Now, where you can escort sediment into polders are the undeveloped ones out in the marshes and the swamps, which of course is the sediment diversions. You just had a major article on the front page of the Picayune the other day on the Mid-Barataria that sounds like it finally has the green light. And I do want to mention a very interesting individual. His last name is Thomasy. He was introduced to me by a colleague of mine, an engineer by the name of Dennis Lambert. And this guy Thomasy in the 1850s proposed what he called colmates, based on the French past participle meaning to fill or to plug. And here was his idea. It operates better in theory. So imagine you have a typical natural levee and back swamp in the lower Mississippi. And imagine that it's all fields out there, okay, no swamps, just wetlands, marshes. And he proposed a checkerboard of ridges, almost like a waffle, okay? And then since the river is higher, he proposed putting in these aqueducts that would take the river when high, divert it, pour it into these little waffle polders, let the sediment fall out, build up the land, and let the water infiltrate. Just repeating this, almost like natural reclamation. And this, if executed perfectly, would have raised this high grounds and made our topography, instead of a back slope like this, more like a plateau like this. But if you think about it, again, execution would have to be absolutely perfect. And I'm wondering, what about the trees, So it's just an illustration that we've been thinking about this relationship between the river sediment and the back swamp and shoring out the soil for quite some time.
Let me just clarify one thing. When I was talking about polders, I'm thinking about something much simpler. Essentially oversimplify, divide the city into, maybe by neighborhoods almost, although natural drainage and high ground stuff would factor into it. Essentially build a series of internal levees. So again, if one compartment breaks, it doesn't flood the entire city. What Rich and John Day are talking about are considerably more complicated.
So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And we have 2 mics, and you need to come to the mic to give your question, and I will call on you. And we'll take the person over here first.
Thank you. And thank you all. John, Rising Tide is an all-time classic. Thank you so much for that book.
Thank you.
We have experienced subsidence. What hope do we have from carbon capture and placing carbon beneath the surface to minimize or perhaps mitigate or perhaps stop subsidence?
Well, I mean, Mark would probably be better at answering that question certainly than I. I don't know about Rich and,
I've actually been asking about that, and there's not really been a lot of research into whether or not pushing carbon down into the same aquifers where or layers where you've already extracted liquids, whether or not it'll make a difference. It has made a difference when we're talking about shallow subsidence and water in Houston and also in California. So there's a potential there, but there would have to be somebody actually saying, yeah, we need to do it, and we need to do some basic research.
And let me say, if you don't know Mark Schleifstein's work, it is really incredible. He is, I think, easily the best journalist in the United States on these issues.
Thank you, guys. I recognize that the lowest part in Orleans Parish on the Mississippi River is certified by the Mississippi River Levee Authority is a 2-foot lower part down by the industrial canal. And the Corps' solution to that is not to fill it in, but to allow a navigation project, which is authorized, to bring the river 12 blocks into the city with high walls so that navigation can have what is necessary for it. And I was wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
No, you. No.
You're talking about Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't necessarily feel a need to take a stand on land use issues like this. It's a good way to undermine the the work I do and the role I try to play. What John is referring to position it in history, the excavation of the industrial canal, the idea is about 110, actually the idea of connecting river and lake goes back to early colonial times, but the execution here had a draconian effect on the metropolis. It severed the delta, the east bank of the delta, in half, and it did so at precisely the time, this is 1918 to 1923, that it was excavated, that the drainage system had been installed, dating to the modern one, 1890s, rendered that much more efficient by the wood screw pumps in 1913, and was sucking down the groundwater so effectively that we started to sink below sea level. This is not a natural condition. Nature built the delta entire above sea level. Below sea level was our anthropogenic engineering accident. So here we are scouring the delta in half, allowing lake water, which of course is brackish, it's seawater, it's a bay, and it's an inch or two above sea level depending on tides, coming into this area that is now sloughing and sinking below sea level. And because it's now drying out, it green lights us to perceive it as safe for development. So we're doing everything you're not supposed to do in the formula for urban risk: exposure, hazard, vulnerability. We're putting more vulnerable people in more susceptible spaces, and we're increasing the chances that a hazard occurs. And so it's no coincidence that the two worst flood wall breaches during Katrina occurred on exactly that navigation water body. Regarding the movement of the lock, I just want to point out, as John well knows, this has been a bottleneck and a controversial issue since the 50s. And I just want to point out that the West Bank had the exact same bottleneck. it was on the Harvey Canal. That was the Intracoastal Waterway. And within a remarkably a short amount of time, the solution was to dig an alternative Intracoastal Waterway, and that is that Algiers Canal, the one that cuts off, and that cut the delta in half. But because the Ninth Ward on both sides was so much more populated and densely populated, and the expropriation, all the complications there, that it has been one of our longest controversial urban planning debates going on a full lifetime now.
That's right. I mean, and what I think is, this is the trouble with land use planning, is that most decisions are made by locally elected officials who aren't held accountable for the decisions that they make for very long. And then somebody comes and then they have to deal with what has been left behind. And it's why I think that we need to have a better paradigm for planning what we're going to do, but we also need to get citizens involved in a way that they know enough to be able to come to a public meeting and say that they oppose this or that land use plan or approve this or that land use plan because it has good science behind it. It's never a consideration. The consideration is what the local council member thinks where something is being proposed. And so I feel in sitting between the two of you that I'm the person who is, in a way, I represent the Luddites of development in New Orleans, because those decisions are mostly made politically, and they politically for people who are friends. So that's why I say what I see for the future is a need to get much better management of people who are drawing up plans for what we should do, and it should include the expertise of the people who live in this city. So, and that actually is my whole point. I mean, I think that land use planning is an admirable field. It has done wonderful things. Not much here, but in other places.
Okay. To zoom away from the sinking city and the issues of water and land use, focusing on an issue that has been incredibly poignant over the past 3 or 4 years, gentrification and short-term rentals. How exactly should a city move forward with economic development when a city cannot ban short-term rentals, when short-term rentals tend to increase costs for those that live here, and when any economic development tends to push out lower-income people, as we saw in Ferret, as we see around the edges of Broadmoor, and as we see on Magazine?
Well, I'll take a stab at this. I've thought, because in dealing with issues of resiliency and trying to protect cities from what's coming, and I can say I'm speaking now both from New Orleans but also from Maine, I think a definition of equity has to be arrived at that's a little different from what we think. It means everybody has to give something up. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Where I live in Maine, I live on the coast in a little town called Booth Bay, where sea level rise is a real issue. And I live, and many people are already flooded by high tides there. And so I know that we have to do something to move those people and to prevent other people from building there. But there are plenty of places that are high. Where I lived, I no longer live there, but where I lived was 300 feet high. And it was on granite, and I had a beach, so right on the ocean we have no problem. But it had been subdivided into 3-acre lots. And what I thought was, isn't it nice that I live there? I don't have to worry. But I should be able to, if not required to, provide 2 more houses on that land. And that's expensive because there has to be sources of water and sewage disposal and all of that. But I think I know too many people in my town, and this is a small town, who sit complacently by because they're fine. And I think that it takes real leadership to say everyone, if we talks cheap about equity, and it isn't cheap, but it's time that we really started dealing with it. So I think that's an excellent question, and it's something that is typical of land use planning generally throughout this country, that people who are fine don't feel any need to do anything except be there and feel fine,
Yes, thank you very much. Given all the major issues that we're talking about here, they're long-term. But I have a practical approach that some of you may kind of chuckle about in terms of context. We moved here, we bought our house a week before Katrina. We bought it in the sliver by the river in the Irish Channel. 2 chimneys fell through our roof, so we got flooded not from below, but from above. But we helped rebuild our community, our town, our homes. And one of the things I've always been fanatic about is, and you may laugh about this, is litter and street because it involves drainage. And I sit here, and you know, we also live in a small town up in Pennsylvania, and we have street sweepers that are continuously going around the city, and we take litter, we take leaves, we take dirt, which don't clog up our system here. And yet I've watched here for the last 20 years, my daughter and her husband, who are graduates of Tulane, have 4 businesses around town, and every one of them, they clean up in front of their business every day. They have drainage problems. Now, so I say, what can we do? These are big problems you're talking about. What can we do tomorrow? We can get, and I submitted a plan to the city 5-6 years ago, which I need to update, to improve the procedures of how we improve litter control, and why don't we keep the things from going in the drains rather than spending millions of dollars having it pumped out, or the drainage not affecting and flooding parts of our city. So, and these were proposals that involved not much additional cost to the city. It's that we have responsibility as citizens, as business owners, as tourists, to keep, to contribute with community, our local neighborhood associations, with people, changing the culture. I've thought about having, I'm an ex-military guy, why not have some homeless veterans train who know how to drive trucks, get on street sweepers and go around this entire city, so that's enough. I just want to just say.
Anybody want to try on this one?
What can we do on Monday morning?
Well, one of the things I think, that's why I said, I think we start in doing planning with finding out what scares people and what they are willing to do. And my notion of a good plan is one that doesn't rely, yes, it relies on the Corps of Engineers and all the big groups, but it also relies on citizens who, if we knew what they worried about, many of those can be solved by, for instance, cleaning out catch basins. And that's the problem in every neighborhood here. And I think that keeping people interested and actively engaged in the things that do help, instead of waiting for the Sewage and Water Board or the Department of Public Works to come by and fix it for you, is something that needs to change if we are really going to deal with these subsidence issues in this city.
I have one very small point. A friend of mine named Brett Davis started the campaign to have Mardi Gras throws that are not going to clog everything. I mean, push the city council to require, and some crews are moving in that direction on their own, but if the city council required crews to have throws that didn't clog the drainage system, that, is a relatively small thing, but it's actually would help, so.
Last question.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all very much for being here to help talk about this. I'm lucky enough to be able to spend a lot of volunteer time with the Tulane Law School Water Law Institute down the street, and we've had an opportunity to work with you all. My question has to do with how we motivate people. And I think back to the plan to build an elevated expressway in the French Quarter. I remember when that happened. And you drive down Claiborne Avenue now and look to see what that would have been like. There were essentially 2 young lawyers who stopped that from happening. How do we get the folks here to realize that instead of worrying about whether we're going to be underwater in 50 years, we pick something and go work on that and find somebody who will help us do it?
Well, I mean, all of you get engaged in something that matters to you, like the gentleman who was just talking about street sweeping. I was asked to serve, sort of recruited to be on the levy board. I'm a writer. It never occurred to me to get into that kind of position. And, so it's up to you. Take a leadership role. It's on you.
Give one little scenario there. New Orleans went into the late 19th century as one of the worst in urban infrastructure. It came out of the early 20th century as one of the best. And one of the pivotal moments was a drainage referendum in 1899 in which women, at least some women, had the vote and came out in large numbers. And the reason why they came out in large numbers to vote for, they were voting to tax themselves. They were voting for a millage that was able to fund the sewerage, the water system, and the drainage system. And that steady stream, volunteerism is great, but if you're really committed to these interventions, you need a hard revenue stream. Now, 92 years later, we had a follow-up because it expired, and then there was a 50-year. 1991, hardly anyone showed up for that. The millage expired, and it's at that point that the Sewage and Water Board, some of its charges, such as the storm drains, got divorced off and sent to Department of Public Works. It's been a problem ever since.
Yeah, it's a good story.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.